There we go. There we go. So I guess take it away, John.
All right, and you'll have to pardon me if you look at your screen, you see I'm up there twice. I'm a bit of a technological Luddite. I have an almost 10-year-old computer that doesn't have a camera, so I use my antique phone in conjunction with my antique computer. So if you see my head turning one way or another, it's because I'm looking at a screen to see some of the materials. Anyway, I have been really looking forward to this conversation and the topic of how to address the threat of extremism within our society and the threat that it poses to pluralist democracy, a threat that's only grown more intense, obviously, over the last several years. So as I said a moment ago, we're really in many ways picking up right where we left off last month. We had talked about the evolution at First Church, kind of the awakening of a more acute social conscience in the early 60s with the arrival of Gil Phillips, who came here from a suburban Philadelphia parish in 1963. And that was a moment that also coincided with a rising concern in American churches generally, in mainstream American churches, with issues related to social justice, democracy, and civil rights. You'll recall a month ago, one of the readings that I had circulated was Gil's sermon, one of his very first sermons on what a liberal church should be. Just a very brief background prior to the 60s. I think if we look really at half a century back to World War I, it's often observed by historians of American religion that the mainstream churches were relatively quiescent on issues of social and political concern during that period. Think of the huge crises in our society, World War I, World War II, where I think we were very unified as a country. And in the case of the Great Depression, the churches by and large didn't focus on issues related to what were the causes of and the inequities that happened there. I would say the churches, the record indicates they were much more focused on playing the role of providing relief rather than posing the question, how did this come about in the first place and what can we do to avoid something like this happening again? But there was an event in the early 50s that did start to awaken the social conscience of the churches in different ways and in different directions for different churches. And that was the appearance on the scene of Wisconsin Senator Joe McCarthy, the communist hunter who really, I think, provoked a pretty intense crisis and caused some division in the perspectives of the different churches. But several of the mainstream Protestant churches, their leaders did take a prominent stand to push back against the kind of the McCarthy witch hunts. And I think it's by the time of the 1960s that we see the churches more generally starting to become more outspoken on issues than they had been in the past. And of course, American churches many decades ago were very politically active, involved in issues like abolitionism, the war for independence in the late 18th century. But we had been in this, as I said, relatively quiescent period leading up to the 50s and 60s. And this brings us to the topic tonight, which is the rising influence of what's been called really the first large-scale right-wing extremist group in the United States, the John Birch Society, which was going to grow ultimately to a membership of around 100,000. And the reason we're talking about it is that given the choice of every street corner in America, where did they set up their headquarters? Well, they landed right across the street from us. And that's because this town was the home of their leader and very pivotal figure, and that's Robert Welch. And Sam, if I could you put up the 5th page, which has a couple of photographs of Welch, and I'll just take a minute to give a little background about him. He was born in 1899, actually toward the end of the year, so just as old as the century. He was born in North Carolina and raised as I'm sorry, Sam, do you have that? There we go. Okay, so that's, we're looking at.
Is this the one?
That's the one. We're
Good,
looking at
great.
Robert Welsh, actually in his office at 395 Concord Avenue. And there in the lower left corner, you see a couple of covers of the magazine American Opinion, which was published by him. It technically was not a John Birch publication, but it was Welch's publication put out by the Society. I've never put my hands on a copy, but this magazine was published for a couple of decades, I understand. Welch, as I said, was born in North Carolina, evidently very bright, learned to read at a very young age, graduated from the University of North Carolina, entered but did not complete either Annapolis, the Naval Academy, and Harvard Law School, where he got into arguments with Professor Felix Frankfurter, later Justice Felix Frankfurter, and he decided not to pursue a career in law. And he went on to try to run his own company as a candy manufacturer. Initially, he failed, but then he joined his brother's company, where he became very successful, quite wealthy, from the production of some of the iconic candies of our childhood. So if you ever had a sugar daddy or sugar babies or my weakness, Junior Mints, you contributed to the Robert Welch fortune. He did try on a couple of occasions to get elected to the Massachusetts legislature, but never succeeded. And he ultimately retired in the late 50s and shifted his energies to political activism. So the Birch Society was founded at a meeting in Indianapolis in 1958. It was named for an Army captain named John Birch, who was captured, tortured, and killed by the communist Chinese in the late 40s, I believe 1947. He was suspected of being a spy and probably indeed was a spy. But Robert Welch developed a mythology around Birch, whom he considered to be the first casualty of the Cold War, this great existential conflict between the Western democracies and communism, principally Soviet communism. So Welch considered himself a virulent anti-communist, and he was an ideologically fanatical proponent of small government. And Sam, you can switch back. I want to show a book that, or actually, you can leave that up. This is the New Americanism. It's a book that Welch published with and the title essay, The New Americanism, I just read, and I was interested to read that Welch was so focused on shrinking the size of government that he writes that he would sooner have a government with 300 crooks than 3,000 honest men. So I think the notion of shrinking government to the size where you can drown it in the bathtub, my bet is it had its origins right here in the John Birch Society. He was also an avid conspiracy theorist, and he propounded theories about the influence of the Illuminati, the evils of fluoride in the water supply. I mean, these are all the conspiracy theories we heard about through the latter part of the 20th century. He believed that General Marshall, George C. Marshall, was a secret, dedicated communist. And most outrageously, he wrote a very lengthy book in the early 50s that claimed that President Eisenhower was an unwitting agent of the Soviet communists. So the theories may sound crazy in the 21st century, but they had an impact in a country that had been conditioned by Senator McCarthy to be suspicious of anything smacking of communism, or even, I would suggest, communitarianism, a more gentle word, social democracy. He was just a absolute staunch ideologue on the issue of shrinking the size of government. So the Birch Society became, in the words I was glad to hear, I think, Jeannie, you watched the Claire Connor video, which I really found captivating. And if others of you haven't seen it, it's about a half hour long, but it's really very interesting. She describes the Birch Society as the most effective, best funded, largest radical right-wing organization in the history of America up to that point in time. And I haven't read anything to dispute that characterization. So the society set up offices in that rather anonymous-looking building that used to sit next to the post office at 395 Concord Avenue. It was torn down and replaced by that much more handsome and distinctive Armenian Cultural Center over the last couple of years. Sam, if you want to put up page 4 for just a minute or so, there were actually 3 buildings in Belmont.
I'll do that.
Where the Birch Society was located. The headquarters was right in the center. Out on Route 60, next to Cityside Subaru, there's I think it's now a repair shop of some kind. But that was their mailing house. And then there was also a research center, folks that used Brighton Street down near the where the old TNT filling station was at the Hill Estates. There's a rather anonymous looking brick building. It's often been a bank branch for banks not from Belmont. Well, that was their research headquarters. And evidently they had a complete set in that building of all of the proceedings of the House Un-American Affairs Committee. So that's where they would do their research. Their headquarters was right in town. And then they would pump out volumes and volumes of material from that mailing house and send it out to their chapters all over the country. The members would meet together. If any of you saw that National Educational Television, NET video, it actually took you inside a Birch chapter meeting in Needham. This was about an hour and a half film. It was produced in the summer of '65, so just a couple of months before the events in question. And you see how the meetings were conducted. It was very top down. Welch came up with the directives. He pumped out all the talking points to the individual chapters. And what the Birch Society did, and Claire Connor talks about this, it was the first political organization, it's certainly sort of right-wing extremist organization that could get very large numbers of people to do the same thing at the same time. So flooding a congressional offices with letters urging congressmen to vote a particular way. That technique started with the Birchers in the early '60s. Now, from the 50s into the mid 60s, the society grew very rapidly. I think we can take the slides down now for a minute or so, Sam. And it was very influential at getting the Republican Party to shift from figures like Dwight Eisenhower to figures more in the cast of Barry Goldwater, who was the nominee, of course, in 1964. And into this situation comes Gil Phillips, who was called from Philadelphia in the fall of 1963. I trust by now that all of you have gotten a chance to look at the sermon. I'll just give sort of a capsule in I hope 5 minutes or so. He says that he hadn't gotten to know much about the Birch Society when he got here. He felt a bit embarrassed that he would go to denominational meetings, and other Unitarian ministers, UU ministers, knew that he was from Belmont. They knew that the Birch Society was located right nearby, and they would ask him rather archly, what does he think? What does he know about his neighbors? What does he think about them? And he had to confess he really didn't know any more than any of the others did. But all of this would change in the fall of '65 when these events happened. There was a meeting of the Belmont Ministerium, which is the old name for what's now the Belmont Religious Council. And as Gil tells it in the sermon, he got seated at a table for 4. And the other people at his table were Rabbi Gelman from the Belmont Temple, the president of the Belmont Council of Churches, who's not named in the sermon, so I'm not sure who that was. And the fourth was Robert Welch himself. So we got a chance to have some informal discussion. And what he gathered, both from the lunch discussion and from Welch's presentation, is that the Birch Society wanted to maintain a low profile in town. It wanted to remain inconspicuous. He knew about the views of the society and he opposed them. He also heard that the Birch Society had specifically been started to target clergy as being potentially communist figures. And in a comment in the sermon that was really reminiscent of Senator McCarthy, he describes how a man named Lohman, who I think must have been on staff at the Birch Society, had published not long ago a list of 2,109 ministers of the Methodist denomination alone who are either communists or fellow travelers. So I think of 205 members of the State Department. And evidently, Lohman was going to develop a list for several other denominations that are much larger, and the Unitarian list, somewhat naturally, being relatively the worst of all. So, and then there's some discussion, and maybe we can talk about this later, where in the Q&A, Gill had asked Welch if he had policemen working in the offices of the Birch Society. And Welch responds that he had not read a curious book called My Life in Little Russia. And there's a history here that I would love to know more about, and maybe let's park it, but it was written by a Belmont policeman about policing in the town of Belmont in the early mid-60s. And it got such a reaction that he was fired and sent to another police department on Long Island, where he was assigned to count rail cars in the middle of the night. So that's a piece of history that I don't know anything more than that about, but would love to learn and find out if anybody here knows anything about that. So after lunch, Gill joins a tour of the society. He's accompanied there by a man named John Rousselot, who it turns out was a former congressman from California, who I did track down an obituary. He was considered the most successful politician ever in the John Birch Society. After a few terms in Congress, he became a staffer there. And then at the end of the meeting, he's given a stack of take-home reading materials. So this book, The Politician, about Dwight Eisenhower, which Gill describes as fantastic or a fantasy. And then a second book was given to him. It was written by Alan Stang, and it's called It's Very Simple. I've never seen this book, but I did. Here's a copy of a picture of the cover showing a white policeman bending over and looking at a young black boy on a city street. So again, a book I haven't seen, but I'm very interested to learn more about, because this book claims that the US civil rights movement was also part of a communist conspiracy. And it asserts that the growing hostility between Black and white Americans is real and being deliberately concocted by the communists, that Martin Luther King was aware of the conspiracy and nevertheless one of the most effective agents of communist influence. Stang in this book goes on to accuse both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson of knowing and allowing all this to happen, and thereby betraying their oaths of office. So I looked up sort of a review of this book just recently, and I think it would be interesting to track down and read. And it sounds like many of the criticisms that were being lodged against the civil rights movement in the 60s are close, if not identical, to the talking points that are being put forward in our time against the Black Lives Matter movement. So that's something I want to dig into a little bit more. Now, beyond the impressions that Gill formed from these written works from the society, he ventures a number of psychological impressions of Welch that were, I thought, quite interesting. In the course of the lunch meeting, he notes that Welch spoke of traps, infiltration, the thought that others were out to get him. He seemed rigid, tense, insecure, fearful, and suffered from, quote, paranoid syndromes. These are the words that Gill used. And as I read these words, I found myself thinking of an essay, very influential essay in American political science by Richard Hofstadter, The Paranoid Style of American Politics, which had just come out a year before. So that's kind of the temperature of what he felt in the room. So moving to his conclusion, when he looked across the street, Gill said he saw a threat to churches and religion. And he urged that it was time for the citizens of Belmont to realize that what pours out of that building is irreligion. He saw Welsh as fundamentally attacking those who would follow the way of Jesus. What pours out of Belmont across the country, quote, discredits almost everything that the man from Galilee died for. So after being silent about the Birch Society, really unaware of it for 2 years, he said he now feels shame. And he urged Belmont to feel shame that this is what the town was being known for across the nation. And Sam, if you can put up the second page that's got there, the Boston Globe published a story about this just the very next day. Previous page.
Previous page, yes, that one.
Yeah, there you go. Minister hits Birchers. So this is the story that appeared. The sermon was on a Sunday, and I believe this was Monday morning's paper. So I don't know who from the Boston Globe was. I don't know if we had somebody had an assigned stringer or what. But in any event, it quickly got publicity, and it was picked up. The other story is a UPI byline, and I don't know that the church put it out, but it was picked up, broadcast across around the country. So it was picked up by a number of other publications, and in fact, several months later, it was referenced in a national magazine, The Progressive, which sort of akin to The Nation or The New Republic, weekly journal of opinion. So he wanted our residents of Belmont to feel shame that this is what the town was known for across the nation. I think it's interesting that he didn't call on their parishioners to try to force the Birch Society out. He said instead, and this was out of the Christian Century, which was an ecumenical magazine for progressive Christians, had written shortly before that, we need to make quiet assertions of truth. We must not be drawn into a situation where hatred evokes hatred. If we attempt a redemptive role, we can expect to be hated, maligned. We shall have to live in this situation with courage and in total identification with the one who taught us what it means to be a bearer of the good news of sanity to a society which is threatened by social illness. We have our resources. And then a line from letter to Timothy, God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of sound mind. So I guess I come away, let's go to page 2 of the, let's see, I guess we got page 2 up. I come away wondering, what exactly is he calling for? By today's standards, it seems to me it was a relatively gentle critique. He wasn't calling for people to picket the Birch offices or petition to have them evicted or anything like that. He wasn't trying to cancel them. He was simply trying to make quiet assertions of truth. So I think it tells us something about the style of conflict that was felt to be appropriate at that time. But Sam, if we could jump ahead one page to page 3, even this fairly genteel critique was evidently too much to bear for the local Birch Society. And you see on the left there, that reward advertisement. A group of local members from Belmont responded by attacking Phillips personally and by name, and vigorously denying that what the Birch Society was calling for amounted to, quote, calling for the destruction of any religion. And in this ad, they characterize his sermon as untrue, defamatory, and a blot on the characters and reputations of the thousands of Christians and Jews fighting communism through their membership in the John Birch Society. And there are a dozen odd, I think there's 14 names. I assume these were all Belmont residents in 1965. I personally don't recognize any of the names. I don't know if any of the older members on the call here might recognize any names. There's also, I don't know if there's a record of anyone actually claiming the reward, but the response from Gil Phillips was not to get into a tit for tat. Instead, what we see on the right is, I thought, an interesting form of response. A large number, not the entirety, but a large number of Belmont clergy organized. This was between October and December. In the month of December, Christmas and Hanukkah, they issued jointly a holiday statement printed in I think it was the Belmont Citizen or Herald, one or the other, before the papers combined, in which he and the others, and I imagine that Gil might have had a role in spearheading this. They combined to produce this joint statement, which is very measured, very conciliatory. It frankly acknowledges the threat of communism, which was felt as being real, I think, by people across most of the spectrum of American thought at the time. But it calls for calm judgment and a full measure of understanding. So really criticizing the Birch Society in fairly low-key language as fomenting hysteria, fear, division, and suspicion. Now, in addition to these, I won't put up any of the letters, but I hope you've had a chance to look at some of the dozens of letters that the church received in response to the sermon. I've tried to be representative. There were many that were pro and many that, I think the cons came in almost right away. There was a flurry of letters attacking him. And then there trickled in really into January, February of the following year, a number of letters from people expressing real support for the position that he had taken. Most of them were signed. There were a few that were anonymous and they were real flamers. And some of them kind of have the tone that you would see in a modern online chat room where people vent their opinions and don't put their names down. So, Sam, we can pull back for a minute and just open the screen. Let's go to talk about the aftermath of this. It wasn't a huge eruption. Things kind of settled down into a quiet simmer that would last for really another 20 years. The Birch Society remained in those offices, and quite, I think, coincidentally, this all happened at the moment where the Birch Society's influence was at an apogee. As I've been researching for tonight's talk, I have found a number of articles about how there was some growing infighting within the group right at this time. After the Goldwater nomination and Senator Goldwater going down to really the most sweeping defeat almost of the entire 20th century, William F. Buckley, who was really seen then as the intellectual leader of the conservative movement, felt that there had to be kind of a firewall to isolate the Birch Society and wall it off from having more influence in the Republican Party. And he published a series of op-eds aimed at this goal over the course, really after the 64 election into early 66, 67. And in April of 67, I found a Saturday Evening Post article titled "Mutiny in the Birch Society," which really marked the decline of the organization. Now, of course, Welch would get older. He was the same age as the Century. The fear of the global communist conspiracy began to recede. The number of members ebbed, and they could, at a certain point, no longer support their expensive real estate in Belmont. Welch suffered a stroke in 1984. He went into a nursing home in Winchester, and he died in 1985. So I think those of us with a living memory of that period of time, the Birch Society was kind of seen as a has-been organization. And it was now we get to 1989. Early in that year, the LA Times ran an article that I found with the headline, "As the Cold War fades, so does the John Birch Society." And the article notes that in a cost-cutting move, the society was packing up and downsizing, shutting had a satellite office in Southern California, and it was moving its Belmont headquarters to one central office outside of Appleton, Wisconsin, which, not coincidentally, was the birthplace of Joe McCarthy. So, and that was, I think, part of the motivation for the move. It was not an accident that they were moving there. And it was at this point that our own Jeff Bradley wrote that delightful piece that I shared with you. And I got in touch with Jeff earlier to ask if it had ever been published. And he tells me no, but I would love to have Jeff weigh in as we move to the discussion in a moment with his thoughts and recollections about that era. Now, finally, if we go, Sam, let's pull up, I think it's go first to page 6.
Sure.
And page 6, I think, talks about we see the story that, that's the UPI story about the Birch Society moving. And we thought that this influence was in our past, but obviously the last quarter century, we've seen a resurgence, if not specifically of the Birch Society, more broadly of extremist groups, of conspiratorial thinking. And indeed, if we flip to the 7th slide, the final slide in that packet, here we see a tweet from the John Birch Society on January the 7th, the day after the insurrection, the assault on the Capitol last year. Just in the last year, I've picked up a couple of other pieces about the Birch Society. A week after this came out, the Washington Post had run an article about how in the 60s, Ronald Reagan and the party had tried to purge the influence of the Birchers from the party. And then very recently, just within the last 2 weeks, an article by a Northeastern University professor, his name is Ed Miller, it ran in the Los Angeles Times, and he concluded with a chilling line: "Today, all of us are stuck on the roller coaster of Robert Welch's political imagination, and we can't get off." I'm going to close with one final strange fact. I mentioned at the outset that Welch was born and raised as a Baptist. What I didn't mention, but you'll find in his biography, is that as an adult, he converted to Unitarianism. Now, there's no record that he was ever involved at First Church Belmont. And in fact, he left the church altogether at or before, or shortly after the UU merger of 1961, because he objected to our church's support for the civil rights agenda. But I found that kind of an astonishing fact after reading all of this. So that's what I prepared. I'm sure people came to tonight with some thoughts or perhaps their own firsthand experiences and recollections. But why don't we pull down the slides and sort of throw it open to have a group discussion?
Well, first, let me jump in and just say an enormous thanks to John. And if we could all celebrate John in any way, audible or not, that we can. I think that was an absolutely amazing talk. That was fascinating. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Yeah, but who wants to jump in and pitch a question or enlighten us? Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much, John.
I was struck, at the very last sentence, of his sermon, talking about, love. I mean, that whole concept, which some people thought was, you're reminded me of even where we stand today about standing on the side of love.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what I think he was really saying
Yeah.
right there, is I need to speak out, but you need to stand on the side of love. I'm not calling for violence against these people, but I have to speak, truth.
Yeah.
And so, that made me think that, maybe there weren't slogans back then or what they were doing, but I think that's what he was saying when I read that. Maybe others, see it differently, but he got it took him a long while to kind of get to that, at the very end. If that's all you read, I think that's the most important part.
Yeah.
And some people castigated him, saying, well, how could you speak out? That's not very Christian. Well, yes, you need to stand on the side of love. That's my sort of top line commentary.
Thanks, Gene. It looks like Jim's got his hand up.
Excellent, John. Really enjoyed it. I wanted to bring up something that corresponds with this, is that one of our most distinguished members ever, Dirk Struick, who died at age 106 in the year 2000. In the 50s, I'll read this from Wikipedia. Just a second, I gotta catch this. Anyway, it was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He refused to answer any of the over 200 questions asked of him, repeatedly invoking the Fifth Amendment. He was suspended from teaching for 5 years with full salary by MIT until he was reinstated in 1956. I will. I'll send the Wikipedia link to Sam or Lillian, and then they can pass it on to the rest of you. But
Yeah.
he was until 2000, and he was a fascinating young man.
Fascinating guy.
My memory, Jim, I think you mentioned him to me, is that John Nichols Booth, our minister, befriended him and would walk around town with him, even knowing that Struick was under this cloud of suspicion, and people questioned whether Booth should go out of his way to befriend him. And he stood on principle and was very supportive of Struick during that time.
He always came to church in a full suit. Tall guy, all dressed up.
Yeah. Jeff, I wonder if you can sort of, Jeff Bradley, if you can.
Jeff had to leave.
Yeah,
he had to leave.
He had to
Oh,
go and
dear.
look. He had to go to a scout. What's it called? A scout
Boy
troop?
Scout.
Boy Scouts.
Ah.
Yeah, unfortunately, he.
2 hours difference.
Yeah, I know. Well, I would love to have Jeff's. I did have a good conversation with him earlier about this. He had prepared his piece. He says he did not get it published anywhere, but I'm glad that it's stayed in our archive to offer his perspective. I must say, I think, as I think back on half a century of American history, and I look at the ebb and flow of influence in political affairs, I think we can look at 1989 as kind of this moment of American triumphalism as the Berlin Wall came down. It was also, as I think about our movement, it was at a period of peak growth in the UU denomination. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this last month, but it's something that I think has concerned me, having now about a 30-year history. We came into the movement in our early adulthood. I would say the late 80s, early 90s was a time of incoming tide for Unitarian Universalism, and the world was opening up, and it was very favorable conditions for our brand of religious liberalism. And it has felt sometimes, with all the catastrophic developments of the 21st century, that we're in a time of manning the ramparts. How do we maintain our place? How do we keep our voice strong in this time when there are so many assaults on religious liberalism? And it's, I think particularly right now with this crisis of democracy and accountability for the terrible developments of last January, it's, I just felt this topic, it actually became even more timely after we first talked about doing this several months ago.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, Jeannie, go ahead.
John, when I listened to the YouTube talk by what's her name, Connors, I've forgotten her first name.
Claire Connors.
She talked about how Birch differentiated a republic from a democracy. And he said, we need a republic, not a democracy. He was opposed to equality and pluralism and diversity, etc. And he said she said one of the key differences was that not everybody gets to vote in a republic, which, and they said the senators should not be elected by direct vote. And the senators who wanted this would go out and campaign, and people would vote for them, voting, with potentially voting away their vote. I just found that very interesting. I see the parallels with the Trump, the Trump people. I find it personally very scary.
Well, Jeannie, let's look back 250 years. This sort of recapitulates the debates that took place with the Federalist Papers.
Right.
And
yeah.
indeed, our founders back, and I think this is a huge topic of conversation now in the era of racial reckoning and the 1619 report. If you look at our foundational documents, I mean, the Declaration of Independence was a strong assertion of the equality of all people. But if you look at the Constitution, indeed, we are a democratic republic, and the theory of a republic in our structure of government, we have elements of monarchy, elements of aristocracy, elements of democracy, and they're all supposed to be balanced. And each of those elements can go bad. A bad monarch can be a tyrant. A bad aristocracy becomes a cacistocracy or whatever. There are certainly plenty of times where aristocracies have been corrupted. And a democracy, if people are not educated, can devolve into mob rule. And I think that's where Welch was focused, is there is a risk if we don't have high standards of public education that simple majority rule can end up being destructive of our highest ideals. So I hear this, I have members of my family who say, our founders didn't intend a democracy, they intended a republic. And I think the important thing is, it is a democratic republic in which we all do have a voice. And if we deprive anyone of a vote unduly, we are corrupting the balance that was intended.
But apparently the John Birchers they didn't want any money from the government to go into public roads or infrastructure, and not into public education. creating this imbalance that they were saying would be so terrible for, or that the imbalance of getting into a mob ruling, an uneducated mob ruling. So
Just to mention this language about America being a republic and not a democracy has come back in the last few years. You even had some Republican congressmen tweeting about this. America is a republic and not a democracy, and it's oddly timed, and it was a bit unnerving that this seems to have become back into fashion on the far right.
It is code. It is code. And I mean, I think one of the things we hear oftentimes in defense of the filibuster is we cannot allow ourselves to become a tyranny of the majority. But there's equally the risk, if you have with a filibuster, that we have a tyranny of the minority, that we have there's the principle to maintain fairness and balance in a pluralistic democratic society. We need to have majority rule with respect for minority rights. But I know it feels to me sometimes we flipped it on its head. We have effectively minority rule with utter disregard for majority rights. We've kind of gone through the looking glass in the last few years, and I think we're at this moment in time where we have to recognize just how severely we've drifted off course, and that's what makes all of this so incredibly timely right now.
Richard, go ahead.
Well, I'm distantly related to Aaron Burr, so that's part of the reason I don't own a gun.
That's so cool.
I'm quite interested in this time period, and apparently, to Jeannie's point, I think Jefferson was favoring an elite group, certainly landowners, as being the ones that could vote. And so at that time when Hamilton and Burr were in conflict, that's how we got the two sides of Congress, one which is just, two people from each state versus a more representational distribution, on the other side. And so we're still in the thrall of that period of our history. I also want to say, and I think I speak for others, that I gave up drinking Welch's grape juice and grape jelly, only to find now that I should have given up the sugar babies.
Sugar
So
baby.
I feel really ashamed of myself for my consumer activism that really didn't work out.
Nicole, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
A little bit of history, actually. The two sides, one is based on Greek history, and the other one is based on the siècle des Lumières, the 18th century French philosophers. And the Greeks not everybody was a citizen in Greece. And this is how the Res Publica, actually in Latin, was established also in Rome. And by opposition, the French completely turned around and changed the whole system. Well, it's not really changed, but they said they would want it to be changed. And the British followed the old Roman and Greek system. So right away, the people who wished to establish a new government in the US they were very well learned people, but they had already the seed of discord within the establishment of their new government. And that is historically based on the difference between the Greeks and the Romans, and then the Brits with the French system of democracy, which has been often touted as being communist, which they're not. So this is my 2 bits of history, factual history.
Thanks, Nicole. I actually had a question of my own. I don't know if anyone can answer it. It's sort of about the present, really, but I'm curious about whether Jack Welch and the John Birch Society was really an indigenous American phenomenon, indigenous in the sense of starting here rather than taking its inspiration from overseas. Whereas now I'm struck by 2 things. The first thing is that the rhetoric sounds really exactly the same as the rhetoric on the far right now. The rhetoric is exactly the same, but a difference now, as far as I can tell, is that the more and more the far right in the United States is finding its inspiration in Europe, right? And in Eastern Europe and in Russia, right? So Hungary is now the model for people like Tucker Carlson and for many of the people on the far right, and the nationalist government in Poland, and of course Vladimir Putin. I mean that's a sort of paradoxical situation. I'm of course the John Birch Society was not inspired by Russia, but I'm wondering if that's a difference between then and now. Is the nature of the far right back then didn't have this, wasn't a sort of global movement in the same way that it seems to be now. I don't know.
Interestingly, the far left is the same.
The far left?
Yep. The far left and the far right are following the same system.
Charlie had a hand up.
About Robert Welch, not Jack Welch.
Did I say Jack Welch?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Charlie's had his hand up for a while.
Go on, Charlie.
I arrived in the church in 1968, which was 3 years after this event. And I wish I'd paid more attention to the John Birch Society. I think it was probably already in decline by the time I came aboard. But I did have a brief conversation with Gil Phillips, who was the guy that gave the sermon, about this. And he mentioned the fact that there's Joseph Malatz. I don't know how I remember. I think the name resonates. Had picketed the church. He was a so-called Polish freedom fighter. I have no idea what the signs that he had said, but he probably said this church is communist, but I have no knowledge. And on that list of people that offered the $100 reward, one name did stick out, Robert P. Clark, who must have been just out of college at the point that this letter was written, but he was a neighbor of mine, or Ethel of mine, for quite a few years after this event. But he was a real right winger. In Belmont, he spearheaded the effort to derail a proposition started by Ann Tobbs Warner, who was a select person and a member of this church, to change the Board of Selectmen to the Select Board. That's happened, but it happened 25 years later, and he helped torpedo the idea to make the name gender neutral. He had a terrible case of uveitis, and he felt that I think he had his own opinion of himself. He was a brilliant man, but because of his conservative views, he had been discriminated against. He went to a small college in Ohio, but his hope had been to go to Dartmouth, where his grandfather had attended, and he was turned down. And during the period, he became an honorary member of one of the Harvard clubs, the private clubs that they have there, and because that was a way he could satisfy his desire to be associated with the Ivies, which he'd been unjustly denied entry when he was a younger man. But he would probably been in very early 20s at the time that this happened. But it's consistent with his character.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was hoping there might be somebody who could furnish a living link, and I thought, Charlie, if anybody could, it would be you. So thank you. And I haven't found anything about protesting or picketing outside the church. I don't know if there might be any record of that in the Belmont papers through that period.
This guy, I didn't go into it, but this guy he did come up with some kind of pamphlet, which included tax on ministers, that out of print. It's out of print, but he described himself. He was a self-described Polish freedom fighter, and that's where he came to his ardent anti-communism and his I guess his willingness to go along with these conspiracy theories.
Mm. It looks like Jean and Jim have had their hands up. I don't know who was first. So okay, Jean, go ahead.
I'll just say I did a quick search for My Little Russia. And if you want to spend $144 on Amazon, there's one left, but it is a copy at the Belmont Library is missing, but there is a copy for special use. If you want to sit in the library and look at it, there is a copy of it at the Belmont Public Library for in-library reference. Thought I'd mention that.
In special collections alongside Lady Chatterley's Lover or something.
Well, Belmont was described as the most boring community in Massachusetts until the Japanese princess arrived and went to
Charlie,
high school.
one of my most interesting,
more interesting.
yeah, one of my most interesting finds in the archives is some of you may remember at the 130th anniversary in 1989, there was a special supplement printed in the Belmont Citizen Herald, and we have a copy on file. It describes Belmont as being like a fine French Chardonnay, dry, white, and very expensive.
Oh boy. Jim, go ahead.
Well, why are we chuckling? Here's another little levity. Does any of you know about what the Association for the Preservation of Wooden Toilet Seats is called?
No.
The Birch John Society.
Wait, is that a real thing, or is that just a joke?
I think Jeff Bradley may have made it up. I can't remember.
Okay.
Nice.
We laugh. Nevertheless, I think maybe going full circle back to Jean's first comment. I think it is very important to figure out how do we, I mean, this is not just an issue in our church, this is an issue in our society and in our world. How do we confront this? How do we, I mean, this is the ongoing debate, I think, in the society at large. We cannot be simply dismissive. We need to figure out a way to, and I think public education is one of the critical aspects of this. How can we get to a point where we can neutralize the effects of these bizarre, I mean, I think, I don't want to use value freighted language, because I certainly, if you go back to the time of the 50s and 60s at the height of the Cold War, there was broad concern about the threat posed by communism around the world. And I think as I read that statement by the clergy in Belmont, a measured acknowledgement, if we as a pluralistic, open, democratic society are to survive and maintain our influence in the world, we have to figure out a way to be tolerant of each other, to provide gentle correction, to have our own ears open. It's a real challenge. And right now, I mean, I think we're in the most acute phase of the crisis really since World War II, right now. So this is an urgent question for us all.
Yeah, so I just want to turn to Ken, who had his hand up, and then to Eleanor.
Yeah,
So go ahead,
I-
Ken.
just a few words. I recall back in the, I guess it was the early 70s, when Nicole and I first came to Belmont, and I had heard through the church of this group, the John Birch Society. So I wandered over there one day, and I think I did meet whatever his name was. But he had these pamphlets, the publications. I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Okay, I'd like to read them." So I got one of them that I got was where he excoriated Dwight Eisenhower as being a fellow traveler and an unwitting fellow traveler and so forth. And I think the best that really could be said of this pamphlet slash the publication was that they were syntactically correct and completely devoid of anything intelligent. They just didn't make a case for anything. They spoke ex cathedra, and therefore you had to either agree with them or admit that you were a heretic. That's no choice. I would encourage people to try to run down some of the pamphlets. Pick one. It doesn't matter. I had read several of them, and they all had this way. They all agreed. You have to agree that we are under attack. You have to agree that it's the clergy and who knows, the butterfly collectors and so forth. And that was the point they kept making over and over again. Needless to say, it was less than convincing. And I don't know how they got a large following. From where? Okay, but I do encourage people, go to first sources. It really doesn't help for someone else to say, well, look how silly they were and so forth. Well, how do you then convince someone else? You didn't see you're just getting someone else's impression of what the John Birch Society stood for and published. And while first sources are available, and it doesn't take these pamphlets are, I don't know, perhaps 10 pages long. So you can easily go through it. I'm not asking anyone to, pour through them, in a Herculean, in some huge task. It's easy to read and even easier to discard.
Yeah. One thing I hope we can do over the coming years is reorganize and re-energize our library, our Seth Gano library at the church. I've gotten a copy of this book, The New Americanism by Welch. I did get Claire Connor's book, Wrapped in the Flag, and I would encourage anyone that really wants to know more about the period, as Jeannie did, take half an hour to listen to her video. But I'll be finishing these, and I'll get these into the library later in the spring. I think this is a chapter that will continue to be of interest to members in the church in the future. And I think having a little section about political extremism and what we do about it would be a very important thing for our church to do.
I have something hopeful in terms of education about that. At Nobles, where you went, John, while I was teaching there, one of my students was from, maybe it was during your time, one of the students was a young Welsh, and he belonged to that family. And I guess through education, I'm sure John Payne, I, and a few other teachers just told them to read certain things, and we spoke with him, and he certainly no longer or never shared those views. So I would say that's a case in point, a very specific case, even from within a family, and we weren't aggressive about it. But he was not like the Welsh family.
Yeah.
Eleanor, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to what John said about Hofstadter's paper, which I found one of the most interesting papers I've ever read about, why certain people have a tendency towards extremism. And certainly Gil Phillips' reaction to his lunch meeting with Welsh fits into that. And I guess what you know, the idea being that there are certain people who are very prone or primed or conditioned to have a fear-based approach to the world and what's happening. And it's very easy to influence them towards paranoia and fear and etc. And what I worry a little bit about is the extreme levels of anxiety in the young people of today and the teenagers and college age. There's a huge surge in mental health needs on college campuses, for example. And almost all of that has to do with anxiety. And
Mm.
just, you know, there's always been a baseline of true mental illness, but the severe anxiety, which makes people susceptible to having their fears preyed upon. And I just worry a lot about that. And what can we do within our educational system, not to necessarily to convince people not to be right wing, but to not have such a fear-based or anxiety-based approach to life unfolding that makes them susceptible. And part of the anxiety is also not liking to deal with uncertainty, that the idea that things are either black and white and there's no gray. Whereas my personal belief, and I believe most Unitarians believe, that sort of life is all in that gray spectrum where there isn't any absolute truth. So if anyone hasn't read the Hofstadter paper, I would recommend it. Maybe, John, you could put it in the chat or something, or send out an email.
That's a good idea for before next month. We can include that just as a follow-up to this meeting.
Yeah. Richard, you got your hand up?
Yes, thank you. I remember, this all has to do with speaking truth to potentially powerful forces. And I remember after 9/11, the first clear statement of what was going on was from Frederick Church of All Souls in New York, Unitarian Universalist, saying that every religion has a seed of evil in it. In terms of our own community, I was at a barbecue with a friend, and a friend of my friend showed up, and we were talking, and he said, "Well, where do you go to church?" And I said, the UU church in Belmont. And he said, oh, with that flag? You actually invite those people? And I was shocked. But then a few years later, I saw him at our rummage sale. He was happy to partake of that. So changing hearts and minds is a complicated process, and we have to go forward with courage, in the face of so much controversy and conspiracy on the cutting edge of truth.
I
Charlie.
think that, I don't know, most of the people with whom I'm close to grow mostly older, are really have never been so concerned about our democracy because we have, I mean, the events of January 6th to any patriotic American ought to be absolutely abhorrent. And yet we have so many people in the Republican Party who refuse to speak up about it. Although I do think that the tide is slowly turning, and hopefully the January 6th Commission will put enough out there, and maybe I would say hope for some prosecutions of not the people who stormed the Capitol, but the people who inspired them, and we can at least move on beyond the former incumbent president. And I think it is likely we will move on from him, but it's not all that clear that we will move on from what he represents and the an autocratic approach to government, a oligarchy, which is controlled by people who have great wealth and don't want to see their taxes raised, only want to see them lowered, and it's a threat to the whole concept that we of democracy. I mean, I grew up with the idea that I'm now much more critical about our Constitution than I was years ago, but you know, we always believed that we were an exemplar of democracy, and we had a very stable system. And all of a sudden, this guy comes along and tries to deny the result of an election, and it's something would have been inconceivable before it happened.
Right. Thank you, Charlie. That was a very interesting perspective, and we value your participation as being one of the longer term members and having that perspective, in fact, over time. And I just want to end, because we're at the end of the program pretty much, by saying again, thank you to John for his incredible work at pulling this together. But also, I want to leave you with the thought that one of the reasons why we're doing this, bringing history to the forefront and not having it just be archival, you know, that this is a living, breathing entity we have created. And we will expand on this, because if you have the long view of history, it will help you to put into perspective the depressing events of particular episodes in our history, especially right now. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about this. We've been there before, we can come out of it. And there are cycles that occur in history. And so, and I really appreciate the fact that all of us are here together to try to make some sense out of this, and make sure that you continue to come, because next month will be a fascinating exploration of the role of women at First Church, especially the women ministers. So John, is there anything, or Sam, that you'd like to end with?
John?
No, I'm just delighted everyone was able to join.
Good.
Can I just say
Yes.
something?
Go ahead.
I take a lot of inspiration from a guy named A.J. Must, who he was outside of the gates to the White House day after day during the Vietnam War. And sometimes people would join him, sometimes it was raining and he was there by himself. And a journalist asked him, why do you keep doing this? I mean, you're not going to change anything. And he said, oh no, that's not why I do it. I do it because I don't want the country to change me. And holding those values in opposition to things in the culture, I think is what we're talking about here tonight, you know? Stay true to your values.
Okay. Well, we'll see you next month.
Yeah, and those of you who are joining the group for the first time, you're very welcome to come back next month. You may be receiving newsletters about the history group from now on. You're free to unsubscribe from them if you don't want them anymore, but I hope to see you guys again next month.
We have a lot of fun.
All right, good night, everyone.
Be well, everyone.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. That was great.
Yeah.
You're good at this.
Oh, yeah.
I thought I heard somebody say the Declaration of Independence. Maybe that's what we're looking at.
All right, good night, folks.